On you go.
Great.
I'll share this. Yeah, I'm sharing the screen. Can you see my screen now? Yeah.
Yes, perfect. So as I've already mentioned, we've got 4 colleagues today, and we're all involved in EAP for the creative disciplines. We did a workshop at the last BALEAP conference, and this is a continuation of that research and that work. And I'll pass on to Claire.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So here are the aims of our presentation today. We're going to focus on our use of cross-institutional collaborative autoethnography as a method for exploring pedagogies and practices in the context of EAP in the creative arts. And in this presentation, we'll cover our approach to CAE, why we chose it, how we conducted the scholarship, and explore the effectiveness of CAE as a research method. In a moment, I'll explain a little bit more about the context where we use this method. However, it's important to note that in this presentation, we'll be going beyond the research project itself to explore the perceived benefits of the method that we've experienced in relation to ourselves, our own journeys as individuals, as practitioners, and as scholars. So, in which context did we use CAE? Well, as Jen mentioned, we all work to at least some or the majority of the extent in EAP in the creative arts. And we were invited to contribute a chapter to this book and focused on our pedagogies. The aim of the chapter, the study that we were doing for this chapter was, as you can see on the screen, so we were looking at exploring pedagogies within a creative arts context and trying to gain an understanding of the link between EAP and creative arts pedagogies and thinking about the implications for EAP practitioners. Our earlier collaborations for the workshop had already raised our awareness of the extent to which our diverse contexts were shaping our practice. And we felt, after doing some extensive reading, that an autoethnographic approach would therefore allow us to study our practices in greater depth. So moving on to talk a little bit about collaborative autoethnography. For the benefit of those who haven't come across it before, here are some definitions. So Ellis et al. Define autoethnography as an approach that seeks to describe and systematically analyse personal experience in order to understand cultural experience. And we felt that adopting an autoethnographic approach offered the opportunity for us to place ourselves and our own experiences at the centre of the research process in order to observe our situated practices. And we felt that the diversity of our accumulated experience and working contexts could provide sufficiently rich data. We recognised that it would be in the collective pooling and interpretation of our narratives that we would be able to generate the data required to meet the aims of the study. And hence this was our choice to engage in collaborative autoethnography. You can also see on the screen collaborative ethnography, which we felt would give us the added benefit of being able to analyse and interpret our data collectively in order to gain a meaningful understanding of the social cultural phenomena of the academic communities of practice in which we work. So I'm now going to hand over to Clare Maxwell, who's going to explain in more detail about the steps of the CAE method that we used for our study.
Claire, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay, yeah, so just very quickly to take you through the process that we adopted of collaborative autoethnography, which was based on, sort of largely followed a variation on the iterative process elaborated by Chang et al., but combined with stages of the process used by Adamson and Muller. And we've represented this with a diagram of a spiral staircase to represent the sort of progress starting from the bottom and moving upwards, but also the sort of cyclical nature of the reflective process. So very briefly to go through the stages, the first stage is identifying the frames for reflection. So these are what are called the narrative frames, so basically the focus of the initial reflections that we decided to focus on. And the two sort of broad areas that we chose were to reflect on our experience of EAP and creative arts, sort of chronologically up to this point. So looking at our sort of past experience up to the present, and then to focus on what Ellis et al. Call a pivotal event. So that's a sort of critical incident that we felt that was important or significant in some way. From there, we moved on to the data collection stage. This is basically effectively the reflection stage. So our reflections were written and shared in Google Docs, and we used the comments function to create a dialogue and in order to deepen the reflection through the use of probing questions that we agreed between us beforehand. And we were also at this stage having sort of weekly and bi-weekly meetings on Zoom as well to discuss further and to try and probe even more deeply into our reflections. For those of you that are interested in the numbers, this phase of the process generated something in the region of between 13 and 14,000 words and upward of 300 comments in a total of 7 documents. Following this stage, we moved into the data analysis and theme identification stage. So we used a method which is called memoing. It's very similar to the coding method used in grounded theory, where we analyse the reflections and the comments and to identify themes. And from here, we identified 4 key themes relating to the creative arts pedagogies or pedagogies within the context in which we work. And these themes were written genres, spoken communication, spaces, so that means working spaces primarily, and also collaboration, generally involving collaboration with discipline specialists. From here, we decided, having identified these 4 key themes, we decided to engage in another round of reflection in which we reflected specifically on each of those themes. This was to sort of help us to synthesize the various observations within these themes, but also to reflect further on the implications for our own, from a personal perspective. And this generated another sort of 10 to 11,000 words and further comments. At this stage, having gone through the 2 rounds of reflection and dialogue, we moved on to the data reduction phase, which is where each one of us decided to basically assume responsibility for one of the themes, and we then needed to reduce it down to sort of extract the essence, the key sort of ideas within that theme. And this allowed us to gain a deeper understanding of our own context, but also the broader context of the creative arts. And in order to sort of produce a more layered account, we tried to match our observations to our ongoing reading and understanding of the literature in relation to the creative arts. It's worth noting that there's, you probably see the arrow there on the diagram on the left. This is relates to reliability checking, which is considered to be an important part of collaborative autoethnography, and involves ensuring that the interpretations accurately represent the originally intended meaning. And this was an ongoing process in our case, which we did through our discussions, our online discussions on Zoom. So I'll now hand over to Anna, who will elaborate further on the next stage of the process.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So now the focus of this presentation is actually to talk about the method, the collaborative autoethnography, and in order to kind of investigate the impact or the perceived impact of that method on us, we followed a very similar process to what Claire has just described. So basically, we reflected on what we thought was the impact of the method on us. And you might have noticed the icon of the camera with a word cloud. And that word cloud represents the reflections that we have written in response to the question of the impact of CAE on us. Altogether, we produced around 6,000 words in total across the reflections, and that attracted 100 comments amongst us. And in some of those comments, we kind of established a nice dialogic process in which we deepened the reflections. And later, when we looked at the reflections, we identified the themes similarly to the previous study. And the themes that we have discovered are basically around the notion or the metaphor of the journey. And it seems like we embarked on 3 journeys. The first one being us as journey as individuals, then journey as practitioners, and journey as scholars. And I'm going to talk about the first one. Let me just move on to the next slide. So in our reflections, right at the beginning, each of us has commented on kind of a feelings of vulnerability, opening up to the others, kind of a feeling like imposters, feeling the presence of the inner critic. And that was perhaps because we were at the time of the first study, we were still relatively new to the disciplinary context. We were very new to the method. It was the first time each of us had used the method. We were aware that we were aware of the perceptions of autoethnography or collaborative autoethnography. We were kind of a little bit worried about the fact that it might lack academic rigor, that we might be perceived by outsiders as some sort of an informal network. However, when we started reading our reflections, we soon discovered that each of us felt very similar, and that kind of normalized the situation for us and normalized the feelings of discomfort, and our curiosity won, and we kept sharing. And we soon discovered that we were able to overcome these feelings of vulnerability and insecurity. And actually, we probably knew more about our practice and the field or the context in which we were working than we imagined. And Claire will be talking a little bit more about it in a moment. And thanks to the reflections and the discussions with each other, we felt validated. We kind of felt our voices finally heard. We felt empowered and motivated to investigate our practice further and work on maybe new approaches to teaching, etc. And again, Claire will be talking about it in a minute. You can see some quotes from the reflections on the slide, and you can see how powerful some of those feelings were. And we believe that that was possible thanks to the fact that we were collaborating. So that collaborative support, collegial support was there for us. And at the time, each of us perhaps was working on her own. So that environment provided a staff room for us, kind of a soundboard, a tribe, that was the word used in the reflections, and kind of an environment where we could talk specific shop, and we could basically motivate each other. So all in all, as in the, oh, sorry, that's, all in all, each of us seemed to have done quite a lot of identity work as individuals during the process. And now I'll hand over to Claire. Let me just use the slide. Here you go, Claire.
Yeah, okay, so I'll just talk through a little bit about the second theme that emerged from our reflections on the CEA process, and that relates to our journey as practitioners. So I've tried to sort of condense this into a diagram because this was the area perhaps where that was most rich in the reflections themselves. And possibly that's not really surprising because this relates to quite closely to the aims of the original study, which was focused on pedagogies, EAP and creative arts pedagogies. So unsurprisingly, you can see there in the themes column, if you like, where the two circles are, the two sort of key sub-themes that emerged were related to our own sort of feelings of professional development and growth from going through the process, and also our understanding of our own disciplinary context. within creative arts. So just to sort of clarify here, really, we're working with a variety of creative arts disciplines, including design, fine art, music, and architecture and other creative industries. So it's quite a broad range of creative arts areas. So a common theme in the reflections was how the process had contributed to our own professional development as practitioners. So it seems sort of inevitable, really, that the engagement in deep and retrospective reflection enabled us, and it seems often for the first time from the reflections, to really take stock of how much we had developed already as teachers, and in particular as ESAP practitioners. So practitioners of English for specific academic purposes. And it felt like it was the first time that we'd really had time to actually reflect on that and see how much we've grown from that. So our reflections contained numerous references to accumulated knowledge and understanding of our teaching context, and as well as our understanding of ESAP and our approaches to it. So there were frequent references to new awareness coming out of the reflections. But I think what's most interesting really is, aside from the reflective process, was actually what was really key was the collaborative nature of the reflective process. So this really seemed to have enriched our understanding, increased our awareness, to sort of shift it into the realm of growth. What we found was that it was sharing our reflections that gave us insight into each other's contexts. But obviously any sort of conversation where you share, have conversations with colleagues, involves sharing ideas and so on, and you can learn all kinds of, get loads of practical tips and so on. We had that, of course, from talking about what we've done, but it was really being able to see each other's reflections, so to understand, have insight into each other's journeys, that helped us gain that deeper understanding. So yes, we picked up sort of practical tools and practical ideas, both in terms of our teaching and in terms of how we were collaborating with the schools in which we work. But it was really more about the understanding of context that made this such a rich experience. So reading the reflections and experience of others led to an ongoing cycle of reflection. So what often happened was we would be interrogating our own contexts and situations, and frequently an observation made in one reflection then became a point of focus for all of us. And this kind of led to lots of little mini discoveries about our own practice that we previously hadn't considered. And this was a recurrent thing about seeing things that we hadn't seen before, noticing things we hadn't noticed before, or seeing significance in things that previously hadn't seemed particularly significant. So we discovered the usefulness of not taking situations for granted, of problematizing and questioning aspects of our own practice and teaching context. And this allowed us to explore and understand, and most importantly, perhaps think about how we could exploit these situations more effectively. So to give some examples, it was evident in particular in discussions that we had relating to how we had adapted and how we were adapting to some of the more sort of demanding creative arts practices. So in particular, the sort of ambiguity of the creative arts pedagogies, things that maybe took us out of have taken us out of our comfort zone. So this might be in terms of, for example, what we might consider to be slightly alien teaching spaces. So moving away from perhaps the teaching spaces that we're all used to, having a whiteboard at the front and a screen at the front of the class and a computer and tables, into more fluid creative spaces, whether those be music rooms with pianos or art studios with that don't necessarily have the sort of chairs and tables that you'd be expecting. Or indeed some of the sort of more unorthodox assessment genres that need unpicking and understanding, visual essays, for example. So this sort of process of shared reflection and discussion helped us to explore these new ways of doing things, and to actually think about the affordances of these disciplinary differences, which we've not really explored before. and how to adapt them and to exploit them rather than sort of keeping ourselves separate from them. So that helped us in many ways to move towards being insiders within our disciplines rather than the outsiders sort of sitting on the edge looking in. And it was here really that we started to see within our reflections evidence of the fact that we were on a journey, that we were evolving as teachers, and dealing with this sort of uncertainty, but being prepared to embrace that uncertainty. So the very final column on this slide really is about impact, but it's with a question mark because we've not done an impact study. Our plan wasn't to do an impact study. That's something that we could perhaps think about. But it's where we've seen the seeds of change within our own practice or the potential for change within our own practice as ESAP practitioners. So now I'll hand over to Jen for the final theme.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So as Ania was saying, we talked about things as being a journey, and this is the journey as scholars. So we started off with the call, which was the new chapter, embarking on a literal new chapter, as Clare Carr mentioned earlier. And then we moved into a new methodology, which was CAE. We came across CAE based on our kind of shared understanding of research and scholarship, and really looking at that multiple interpretations and different voices, and the fact the value of our own practice and our own experience. And it kind of spoke to all of us and was something we really wanted to explore. As Ania was saying, there was a lot of trepidation. It was new and different, and other people had different views on it. But we were finding that as it was a shared endeavour, it went beyond like individuals just reflecting on their practice and became just a much more powerful, much more interesting, and it went beyond that individual, became much more motivating and supportive. We could help each other with work schedules and that kind of thing. It also meant that there was a much deeper exploration in terms of being able to share that analytical frame and keep, as Clare was talking about, those different stages, because they were all shared. We were always cross-checking and talking to each other, asking each other questions, discussing online. So it was much deeper and richer, and gave a richer and thicker description of our context. It also presented opportunities for us to make that familiar strange, so our own context and our own practice and pedagogy, and also helped us to identify potential avenues for the future, so blind spots, things that we weren't so sure about. So Clare was mentioning different genres and that kind of thing, so looking at different routes for the future. And then in terms of that transformation, it's that confidence and empowerment to conduct our own research, and particularly as a group, we're just so much stronger and kind of looking at things in a deeper, more analytical way. And then the value of, again, of our own stories and our own experience. Somebody earlier in the week brought up Harvard about it being EAP practitioners doing their own experience, doing their own research based on that vividness, and ourselves as individuals, practitioners and scholars. So if we go to the last slide then, and I'll try and wrap everything up. So really, we saw it as a framework of systematic exploration of pedagogy that was analytical and collaborative. It was flexible, accessible, inclusive and systematic from our experience. There's also quite a lot of potential affordances. Our focus was on pedagogy, and we found out a lot about creative discipline pedagogies, but also our own pedagogy and practices. We've had a lot of discussions about it, and we thought maybe TEAP or teacher education, which is coming up a lot in this conference, it may be an interesting field for that, or an interesting method for looking at that. And also then co-researchers. So for example, looking at working with other practitioners, as in this example, but perhaps other people in other departments, so these subject specialists, or working with students, but also being able to combine different methods of reflection alongside those qualitative reflections. So you can do more kind of evocative reflections, but then also different analysis. So perhaps critical discourse analysis, some corpus analysis, and other methods could be incorporated within it. So yeah, I went through that quite fast, so I'm sure there are lots of questions. But yeah, great. I think one of our first questions was about how we met. I saw that come up quite